All right.
Kind of looks like one though.
All right, everyone. Good to see you all here today. I'm back after my week-long hiatus. I'm feeling mostly better. So, in the way of announcements, even though it feels like we just had one, since we had one in the middle of the week, we have another Pancakes of Pontification this weekend, Saturday. So, this is now at our normal time, so it'll just be every first Saturday of the month from here on out for the rest of the semester. But still, I encourage you, come on down to that, ask your questions, have some pancakes, all the usual.
It's at 6 p.m., right?
Yes, 6 p.m. Denny's on Preston and stuff. An announcement will come out at some point. So that should be all for now, I think. So I'll hand it over there.
All right, yeah, I just wanted to give an intro to Ryan since Seth just met him. I've known Ryan for a while, our speaker today. First of all, by way of confusion, if you've been following the schedule, the topic doesn't match what was planned, and that's because Raj had an emergency. Our scheduled speaker, his sister is having some severe medical issues. He had to fly to India this week to try to help with that. So anyway, hopefully we may take Ryan's slot later. We swap a little bit. So the topic for today is going to be the sort of the self-understanding of Jesus, and then we're going to go into our world religion series after that and hit Buddhism and cults and Judaism and some interesting things and looking at them sort of evidentially, somewhat from a Christian perspective, because I have to admit the speakers that we have speaking about them are now Christians, but people that come from those backgrounds or know a lot about the backgrounds. Yeah.
Are y'all going to do one on Islam?
We don't have one in the schedule this semester on Islam, but we should do one on that as well, since it's obviously sort of the second largest world religion.
We can invite Yabu back to give that speech.
That's right. Yeah, we could. And we haven't had Sharif coming lately, but our Muslim friend that attends these meetings is...
I think he graduated.
Okay, he's totally off campus. I didn't even know. No wonder. Good, he doesn't just hate us then. All right, so anyway, yeah, as far as Ryan, a bit of background. So he started and led an apologetics group at Baylor for a number of years. It was very successful, grew to be pretty large. And then he moved here with work, and he's now a DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary student. And he's basically in his last semester, which is pretty exciting. Plans to get a PhD, though, and teach, hopefully something biblically related at some level. So he's very...
since that'll be what my degree's in.
Yeah. So he's really an awesome guy. He's also on the board of Cross-Examine, Frank Turek's organization. So he's giving inputs to help guide that. And very knowledgeable, as you'll see, very articulate speaker. So welcome, Ryan, with me here.
It's been a few years, but it's good to be back. Good to see a couple of faces that I recognize. Not many, but yes.
Yeah.
I don't know quite how long it's been now. It's been a couple of years.
Yeah.
But anyway, I actually want to open a little bit differently than I did last time. I think there's probably only 3 of you that's ever heard me give this talk before. But those 3 might recall that this is a little bit different. But I want to read you something and get your thoughts when we're finished. From the beginning, his mother knew that he was no ordinary person. Prior to his birth, a heavenly figure appeared to her, announcing that her son would not be a mere mortal, but would himself be divine. This prophecy was confirmed by the miraculous character of his birth, a birth accompanied by supernatural signs. The boy was already recognized as a spiritual authority in his youth. His discussions with recognized experts showed his superior knowledge in all things religious. As an adult, he left home to engage in an itinerant preaching ministry. He went from village to town, preaching the message of good news, proclaiming that people should forego their concerns for the material things of life, such as how they should dress or what they should eat. They should instead be concerned with their eternal souls. He gathered around him a number of disciples who were amazed by his teaching and his flawless character. They became convinced that he was no ordinary man, but was the Son of God. Their faith received striking confirmation, in the miraculous things that he did. He could reportedly heal the sick, predict the future, cast out demons, and even raise the dead. Not everyone proved friendly, however. At the end of his life, his enemies trumped up charges against him, and he was placed on trial before Roman authorities for crimes against the state. Even after he departed this realm, however, he did not forsake his devoted followers. Some claim that he had ascended bodily into heaven. Others said that he had appeared to them alive afterward, and that they had talked with him and touched him, and became convinced that he could not be bound by death. A number of his followers spread the good news about this man, recording what they had seen him say and do, and eventually some of those accounts came to be written down in books that circulated throughout the empire. So who am I talking about? This isn't a trick question. Wrong. The problem is, I doubt any of you have ever heard of them, because I am not talking about Jesus of Nazareth. I am instead talking about the Neo-Pythagorean pagan holy man, Apollonius of Tyana. Hold that thought for just a second. And I suspect that you've never heard the name of this miracle-working Son of God. This man was Apollonius of Tyana, a worshiper of the Roman gods whose life and teaching are still available for us in the writings of his later 3rd century followers in the book The Life of Apollonius. So, the question is Jesus really that unique? Now, this is from a textbook, actually a very well-respected textbook by Dr. Bart Ehrman, Oxford University Press, so it's no joke. It's a serious scholarly work. And Ehrman tries to demonstrate, hey, Jesus is not unique. There are other people who do the things that Jesus does. The things that we think make him so special are not really that special after all. But here's the problem. You guys have all heard of Jesus, and none of you have heard of Apollonius of Tyana. Why is that? What is different about those two figures? Now, part of the situation, if I can call it bluntly for what I think it is, I believe that Ehrman has exaggerated the similarities between Apollonius of Tyana and Jesus of Nazareth. And there's some other people that get mentioned in that context as well, and I think they're a little bit exaggerated as well. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Is Jesus that unique after all? If you try to think of somebody who's had a greater impact on the course of human history in the last 2,000 years, I suspect you will have a hard time thinking of anybody more impactful than Jesus. Like I said, you've all heard of Jesus, but none of you have heard of Apollonius. But there is still a problem. That could be because of an accident of history. Is it possible that we know about Jesus because Christianity won, whereas Neo-Pythagoreanism, if that's even a word, didn't, right? Is that possible? That's what we're going to entertain this evening, is there something special about Jesus after all? Did he claim something during his lifetime, not just in Apollonius' case? People wrote stuff about him hundreds of years later, possibly even as a polemic against Jesus. Did Jesus say stuff in his lifetime that no one else has ever said? Or at least no one else has ever said and been able to demonstrate? Was Jesus just a great moral teacher? Was he a great ethicist, a wise, holy man like Apollonius, or was he something else? So tonight, that's the question we're going to deal with, is the self-understanding of Jesus Christ. Who did he understand himself to be? Now, typically, I think it's probably best if we hold questions till the end, just because I'm going to cover a lot of ground and want to get through it quickly. But you had your hand up, sir, so let's hear it real quick, and then we can move on.
Is this Apollonius guy associated with one of those, mystery religions?
He was. Well, is that true? Hold on. I started to say that, but actually I'm not. A lot of people were, let me say it this way. A lot of the people that get compared to Christ were associated with the mystery religions. And if you haven't heard of the mystery religions, sometime actually after Christianity became popular throughout the Roman Empire, that there were these kind of mystical cults that developed. Many of them kind of quasi-Gnostic in character, where there was an emphasis on secrets and special knowledge. But some of the mystery cults, perhaps many of them, I haven't studied them a ton, but have this concept of the divine man. And a lot of people want to compare Jesus to those guys and put him in the same category. I think it's fair to ask, though, who came first and who's copying who? Because a lot of times people will say Jesus is copying them, but they actually came after Jesus, so maybe they were copying Jesus. And I think Apollonius might be in that case as well. That's a very good question. Think of those kinds of things, and I definitely want to get through this as quick as I can so that we can have some discussion. But let's move on and dive in here. So this issue, Jesus' identity, it's not a new one, obviously. And C.S. Lewis talked about this in his radio broadcast during World War II, which later became Mere Christianity. Lewis came up with something that has since been called the trilemma, if any of you have ever heard of it. I want to read you something that's now in Mere Christianity that expresses kind of the situation that we're facing here. So Lewis first said on the air, then later wrote down, "I'm trying here to prevent anybody from saying the really foolish things that people often say about him, that is, Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing that we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any of this patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." So the trilemma, if you didn't detect it, is liar, lunatic, Lord. Jesus has to be one of those three things. He cannot be a great ethicist. He cannot be a great moral teacher if he claimed to be God. He's either crazy, or that's really who he is. The problem with Lewis's trilemma for a lot of people, and where this talk comes in tonight, is that it assumes Jesus actually said this stuff. That's the problem. I don't know your backgrounds in here. I don't know if everybody is a Christian or if we have some non-Christians in the room, but if we do, and I'm going to assume that we do just for the sake of argument, you're not necessarily going to take for granted that just because in John 8 Jesus says before Abraham was, I am, alluding to Moses and the burning bush and God revealing his name to Moses, I'm not going to assume that you're going to take that at face value and believe that all of Scripture is the inspired Word of God, and that just because he seems to say it there and Paul seems to say it in his letters, that necessarily means Jesus actually said that, right? Because that's an assumption of evangelicalism. Now, I think it's a good one. I am an evangelical. I do believe that Scripture is the inspired Word of God. But in order to reach across the aisle and have conversations about this kind of thing, we have to entertain the possibility, what if it wasn't? How would we get to where we are as, if you're an evangelical, as evangelicals, with our understanding of Christology without assuming inspiration? Is that something that we can do? I think it is. And so that's really what I want to do tonight. I want to ask the question that the disciples asked in Mark 4:41 when they were on the Sea of Galilee in the midst of a great storm. Mark tells us that there was this big tempest, and Jesus rebukes the wind and the storm, and everything goes calm. And they marvel and look at one another and say, "Who then is this man that can command even the waves and the wind?" That's the question I want to ask. Who is this man in his own words? So the issue is going to be, how are we going to go about investigating this if we don't assume inspiration? This is the way I want to do it. I want to focus on the Christological titles. Now, if you've never heard that phrase before, this refers to the three designations that get applied to Jesus. So one of them is Christ, or Messiah, right? That's the first one. The second is Son of God, probably the one most familiar to people today. But then third is actually the most important and perhaps the most neglected outside academia, Son of Man. Did Jesus believe that he was each of these three things, and what does that mean? That's where I want to go. But we have to set some ground rules as we get started. This is going to be our roadmap, by the way. We're going to work through these one by one, start with Messiah, then we'll go to Son of God, then Son of Man, and we'll land the plane and have some discussion after that. But we need to talk about ground rules briefly before we move any further, because as I said, I don't want to assume an inspired Bible. I believe in an inspired Bible. The problem is, the people I'm talking to, not you, but like just in general, dialoguing with, don't. Maybe some of you don't, I don't know. And that's fine. We are committed to the pursuit of truth wherever it leads, and so we need to be able to have conversations that bridge the gap and engage with people from all different perspectives. I've said that already this evening. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the best way that has been proposed so far This is actually a hotly debated subject. Even right now, there's people disagreeing on how to do this. But to date, one of the best ways that's been proposed is using something called the criterion of authenticity. Has anybody heard of those, out of curiosity? One? Because did you hear me say it 3 years ago? No, that's good. I always like to ask that as a heuristic question to see how much to lean into these, or if everybody already knew it, we can kind of skim through this. But the criterion of authenticity are designed to be tests of historicity. So, litmus test to assess, is this thing that is reported about Jesus, that Jesus said, is it actually historical from a skeptic's point of view? And the issue isn't, did the Gospels say it necessarily, right? It's a little bit more nuanced than that. So there's three in particular that I want to use. But I want to make something really clear up front. If something doesn't meet these criteria, I am not saying that it is unhistorical. Like I already told you, I showed my hand. I am an evangelical. I believe the Bible is the inspired word of God. And I think there's a lot of things that don't meet these criteria, that are historical. But it's a high standard of proof. So if something does meet them, we can be pretty confident, yep, that happened. Even if I'm not a Christian, even if I have a very low regard for the Bible, we can agree as intellectuals there's a good chance it happened if it meets these criteria. Usually there's 7 that get talked about. There's 3 that are especially important for the events that I want to talk about tonight. So let me give you a quick flyover, and then we'll dive in. The first one, and by far the most important, is called multiple attestation. The idea with multiple attestation is if something is recorded in 2 or more independent sources, it is typically regarded as historical bedrock. Okay? This is not a biblical studies thing only. This is anything, right? If we were studying Homer, and we could theoretically find independent sources to Homer that corroborated the, events of Heracles, the things that he did or the things that happened in the Trojan War, yeah, okay, that's great. That's going to be lend some credence to the historical reliability of those events, just like we would apply here. The catch is, with multiple attestation in the New Testament, is that the individual Gospels do not necessarily count as independent sources. Why do I say that? You've heard the term synoptic, right? Applied to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Does anybody know what synoptic means, by the way, like where it comes from? Yeah, shoot.
Same eye.
Yeah. So the idea is like seen together. And what we mean by that is that there is some level of interdependence. Now, there's some disagreement on this, but the typical opinion is that Mark wrote first, and that Matthew and Luke, to some degree, used material that Mark had already written in the creation of their Gospels. Now, the question of why they did that bothers some people, and that's actually a great topic for another discussion sometime. Why didn't, if Matthew was an apostle and Luke, traveled with Paul, why did they need to use Mark? Part of it had to do, I think, with the expense of writing in that day. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but writing was very expensive back then. And so if somebody has already said concisely events that you can be like, yeah, I was there, that's good, that's right, then why reinvent the wheel? That might be part of it. I don't really want to go further than that tonight. But that causes a problem, because if Matthew and Luke use Mark, and something shows up in Mark, that doesn't necessarily mean when you see it in Matthew and Luke that it's an independent source. And remember, we're adopting a skeptical hermeneutic here. We're going to assume that it's not independent unless we can establish reasonably that it is. So that's a problem. How do we get around it? John is really helpful. I don't know if any of you have ever noticed, John's really different than the other synoptics. Again, that's a different conversation, but for our purposes, that's actually really helpful. Because if something shows up in John and it shows up in the synoptics, that is universally agreed. You should never say universally, but you get the idea. Very widely agreed, you've got 2 independent sources. The other thing is that you have some material that is shared between Matthew and Luke that does not show up in Mark. That is also treated as an independent source. So if you get, they call that Q, by the way. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Q before. Again, topic for another time. Not really the point, but if something shows up in that material, something shows up in Mark, something shows up in John, those are all treated as independent sources. And of course, anything extra biblical is also going to be an independent source. And we actually are going to have a couple of those tonight that we'll bring in. So that's multiple attestation. The next one, multiple attestation is the most important, but the next one is a pretty close second. It's called the criterion of embarrassment. I have a chicken here because and the rooster crowed twice when Peter denied Jesus 3 times, right? And that is the epitome of embarrassment to Peter, which, what does that tell us? Peter almost certainly did deny Christ 3 times, because let me ask you something. If you were inventing a movement, and Peter is your spokesman, he's your head guy, and you're all colluding, and you're like, what are we going to write down here? It's like, hey, Peter, I'm going to have you deny Christ 3 times. Sound good? And you're the leader, by the way. And he's like, yeah, that's a great plan. Let's do that. No, right? That's never going to happen. So the fact that that is in the story is because it was in the story. It really happened, right? And I think most people would agree with that. So this can be applied to Jesus too. If there are events or sayings that are embarrassing in some form or fashion, there's a good chance that, yeah, this is the real deal. We're not dealing with any kind of church tradition here or something that, you know, the apostles fabricated. They wouldn't fabricate this. This is something that really happened. So embarrassment is also really important. Now, the last one is called rejection and execution, or at least that's what I'm going to call it tonight. One of the things that almost everybody agrees about with Jesus is that he was executed on a Roman cross. Okay, that's in all 4 of the Gospels, and it's in the extra-biblical literature. It shows up in Josephus, who is a Jewish historian around the turn of the century after Jesus, but near contemporary. It appears in Syriac work, and I'm forgetting the exact name of it. Bar Serapion is the guy's last name, son of Serapion. I can't remember. Mara, maybe? But the point is there's some extra biblical sources too that mention the execution of the King of the Jews.
Yeah, I think Tacitus mentions it as well.
I believe he does, yeah. Or Tacitus says, he makes mention of that's Suetonius is correct. You're right. There's several sources. So they give different details, but it's very well supported that Jesus died on a Roman cross during the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate. Right? When he was the governor of Judea, the Roman province of Judea. There's pretty much no disagreement about that. Why that's important is if there is anything that happens in the life of Jesus that might explain why he died, there's a good chance that that's authentic. Why is that? Because you don't get killed for being a moral teacher. You don't get killed for being an ethicist, for the most part, unless you're confronting, Socrates went to war with the ruling oligarchs of his day, and he got killed. But for the most part, philosophers don't get executed, right? And moral teachers don't get executed. You get executed for sedition, particularly in the Roman Empire, right? There's a saying that Darrell Bach, who is a great New Testament historian and scholar, teaches at Dallas Seminary. He likes to say, Rome believes in law and order. You obey our laws or we'll put you in order. And the way they put you in order is by hanging you on a cross. So if you were claiming to be a king and Rome did not appoint you, that's it. They don't have tolerance for that. So anything that contributes to that issue, there's a good chance that that's authentic, because we know that Jesus was killed. So I'm going to slightly break my own rule, actually, and ask, does anybody have questions about the criteria before we move on? Yeah?
Why exactly does rejection and execution make the source more historically valid?
Because nobody gets killed for being an ethical teacher. So if it explains the reason why Jesus was killed, there's a good chance that that is an authentic event or appear to be. Some of them might make sense as I go through them, but the idea is, Jesus' parable of the mustard seed, that's not going to get him killed, right? Jesus saying, not that he said this in so many words, but if he said, I'm the king of the Jews, that's going to get him killed.
So this is less a general criterion that can be used on any document to see if it's
No, yes, thank you. That's a good clarification. This one applies to Jesus. The other 2 are good in general. Some of the other 7 are good in general. This one was developed specifically for Jesus of Nazareth. And there's some other ones too, like, if things, and these start to get a little bit fuzzy, but if you have things in the Palestinian milieu, it's actually, I learned recently that Palestine actually wasn't coined as a phrase until Hadrian after Jesus, so it actually would be more accurate to say in the Judean milieu, but I'm not used to saying that yet. I gotta work on that. But anything that is characteristic of Second Temple Judaism, for example, and not like the early Christian period, that gets a little bit of a bump. That's kind of unique to the New Testament. Another one that is really hard to establish, but when you have it, it's gold, is called dissimilarity. particularly double dissimilarity. And the idea there is if Jesus says or does something that's totally different from Judaism and totally different from the early church, where did it come from? Because you wouldn't say that the church invented it, and you wouldn't say that they inherited it from the Jews, so where did it come from? Probably Jesus, right? And there's only one thing that we're going to talk about tonight that fits that sieve, because it's really hard to prove. And, why? Because Jesus was Jewish. So, of course, he's going to import stuff from Judaism. And the early church were Christians. So, of course, they're going to say things that Jesus said. So, that's a great one to illustrate the point that just because something doesn't meet double dissimilarity doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that by that method, you can't argue, hey, this is definitely going back to Jesus, because it could have come from the Jews, it could have come from the church.
So it'll be sort of like having the murder weapon makes it more obvious that someone was the murderer, but not having the murder weapon doesn't mean they weren't.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, helpful clarification. Absolutely. Okay, yeah, sure. Oh.
Yes, actually, I had a question.
Thank you. I was wondering on the first criteria, it talks about multiple testimonies, which makes sense. Like statistically, it is more statistically likely that something that's said by multiple people is true. But I think on the second criteria, are there any questions of claims on invalidity because it's based on a psychological postulate on how people are,
Sure.
averse towards embarrassment, but that does not necessarily rule out the possibility of someone having seen through that.
Yeah, totally. Like, at the end of the day, I think, if I can frame it this way, at the end of the day, somebody could have sat down and written a book about himself and made it really embarrassing, right? That's the problem, I think, that you're pointing out. Even though most people behave in a certain way to try to save face and not say embarrassing things about themselves, that is not true for everybody. That is fair. The problem with history is that it isn't an exact science. And so things like multiple attestation are great when we have them, but we have to work with the things that we have available to us. And so we're always working in terms of probability. We're not working in terms of absolute proof or statistical significance because we can't. History just doesn't work that way. But what we're doing is we're moving in the direction, kind of like in a courtroom, and especially in a civil case. What is the preponderance of the evidence here? What is more likely than not to be what's going on here? And more likely than not, people do not put embarrassing things about their leaders and themselves into documents, for the most part, especially not across multiple sources. So if you combine it with multiple attestation, the fact that you get embarrassing material in Matthew, Luke, in Mark, in John, even in other places, that's unlikely that they all did that, right? Or even that one of them did it is unlikely. The fact that multiple of them, for example, to throw Peter under the bus again, I'm gonna have to apologize to him when I get that. He's always such a good example to use for this. I feel so bad for the guy because we all mess up, but are they all going to mention Peter denying Christ 3 times and him being called Satan by Jesus? And, Paul says when he goes to Antioch, and, he's already gone to the Samaritans and to Cornelius, who's a Roman Gentile. So, he's already started the Gentile mission. And yet in Galatians, Paul tells us he comes to Antioch and all of a sudden gets turned away by the Judaizers and won't eat with the Gentiles anymore. After the Jerusalem Council, some people would say, I think it might be before. But the point is, Peter messes up all over the place, in the Gospels, in the epistles. Would everybody do that and call their leader out like that if he didn't really do those things? I don't think so. I think that that's pretty good evidence that that's really who Peter was. We're getting a very round character, to use a literary term, right? We see a lot of growth and development in Peter and a lot of his hard edges that we don't expect if we're just making something. So it's a probability thing, not an absolute science. But that's a good question. Okay, how am I doing on time? We go to 8:15?
Yeah, we try to end around
Okay,
that.
let's go just a touch faster. I am going to, at this point, probably take additional questions at the end. Keep them coming, by the way, but I'll try to get through this quickly. So let's talk about the first one, which is Messiah or Christ, right? Because Christ is just the Greek word Christos, which means Messiah or anointed one, Mashiach in Hebrew. this expected, long-awaited king of the Jews. Did Jesus believe that that's who he was? By the way, something I didn't say at the beginning. In our outline tonight, we're going to be going up a ladder. So the lowest rung in terms of Christology is Messiah, right? Because he could be Messiah and be a human. And then we're going to go a little bit higher and go to Son of God. And then we're going to go a little bit higher and go to Son of Man. I didn't make that clear at the beginning, but just so that you're kind of aware of what I'm doing here. I want to start with a passage that I was actually talking about with Alan and Sarah, right? Outside before we started, and that is in Mark 8. So in Mark 8, Jesus and his disciples go to this region in the far north of Galilee. I think it's still in Galilee, called Caesarea Philippi. Okay, and Caesarea Philippi is a Roman area, and it is a staunchly pagan area. Lots of idols. There's even a temple to Augustus there, the worship of the emperor. And while they are in this area, actually while they're on the way, Jesus turns to his disciples and he asks them, "Who do the people say that I am?" And that's where we're going to pick up the account. So Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist. And others say, Elijah. And others, one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about it. So, let's talk about this a little bit. Jesus elicits this confession from Peter that is, you are the Christ, so you are the Messiah. Some will take issue with the fact that Jesus doesn't say, "Yep, you're right." Now, in Matthew, according to Matthew's account, he does kind of say that, but let's just go with Mark for the time being, assume, the least that we can know. Is it the case that you would strictly charge someone not to tell anyone if you disagreed with what they said? I don't think so. I think the reason that Jesus is telling Peter, "Hey, don't go around saying this yet," is because Jesus is affirming what Peter is saying here, that he is the Christ. Why would he do that? Let's go to the third criterion. What did I say earlier about Rome and law and order, right? You don't claim to be a king that Rome did not appoint. You get executed. That's not what the Jews were expecting, an executed Messiah. They were expecting a political, military hero and religious hero. And so Jesus has to teach the disciples and all the people watching what it means to be the Messiah before he goes public with them. Okay, so he tells them, this is called the Messianic secret. He doesn't let them reveal it to anybody until he reveals it himself a little bit later on when he goes to Jerusalem, and then a week later ends up being executed. So this fits very well with rejection and execution. It also fits with multiple attestation because this shows up in both the Synoptics and in John. Now in John, it's in a little bit different form. John doesn't tell us they're in Caesarea Philippi. A couple of the dialogue is changed, but the core confession is the same. Peter answers Jesus and says, "You are the Christ." And Jesus apparently affirms that. So we have multiple attestation. We have rejection and execution. And what happens immediately after this is part of the same story. Does anybody remember?
Here, the prediction of the passion.
And then,
And
before
then,
that, after that, before that,
and then get behind me.
"Get behind me, Satan." Because Jesus tells them that he's going to be executed. And Peter's like, no. Remember what I said? The Jews were expecting, this military leader. They're, triumphant king, not somebody who's going to suffer and die. And Peter is a good Jew, and so he knows that and starts rebuking Jesus and saying, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." One of the most embarrassing things that you could possibly say to the person who's going to become the leader of early Christianity. And that's all the same story. So we get to apply that here. That criterion of embarrassment surrounds the whole narrative. That Peter gets an A on the first exam and absolutely bombs the second exam in the span of like 2 verses. So in this pericope, we have all 3 of the criteria working in to our advantage. There's a good chance that this actually occurred. Now, I mentioned Jesus revealing his identity a little bit later on when he goes to Jerusalem. Let's talk about that. This event to Christians is called Palm Sunday. All right, in the New Testament, in New Testament academia, it is often referred to as the triumphal entry. And on, is it March 31st, I think? March 30th, there isn't 31st, March 30th, AD 33, or maybe a slightly different date if you hold to an AD 30 crucifixion. We're not going to get into that. Either in 30 or 33, Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey to the great acclaim of the crowds as they throw down palm fronds and shout, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. For time, I'm not going to read this one. I'm just going to talk through it. But Jesus enters in this fashion. Opposite side of the city from where the Praetorium was, or not the Praetorium, what is it called? The Antonian Fortress, where the Romans' encampment was. So they can't quite see what's going on here, because there's some question, why wasn't Jesus just arrested right there and then? They're kind of on the opposite end of the city, but it's approaching the temple, right? And he goes to the temple. And what he is doing is very similar to how a conquering hero would enter a city, or a diplomat, or an Augustus. If you read Dio Cassius, or Tacitus, or Plutarch, or any of these other Greco-Roman historians around the same time, this is a pattern. Guy comes in, he's on a war horse, he has a big entourage behind him, people are acclaiming, and shouting, and that's how he makes his way into the city. Jesus does the same thing, and you even have the way that you know that people are seeing this through a messianic lens is they're shouting, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of our father David. And blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. What's that about? They're thinking of the messianic kingdom. They think this is it. He's the guy. He's coming. He's the one that is going to be from the line of David and be the Messiah. And they're throwing down palm leaves. Why are they doing that? Well, during the Maccabean period, the palm leaf became a symbol of Jewish nationalism. Okay? It would be like throwing down, I'm trying to think of a good equivalent today.
Bald eagles.
Assume that that's something that you could collect easily and throw out.
Let's assume that we're releasing live bald eagles and they're like
That works too. Yeah, let's just say American flags, right?
Freeze dry.
So, a monarchy. There's so few left in the West, but like in England, I'm trying to think of what's like other than tea, what's the greatest symbol of English nationalism? I don't know, but if you were to
Union Jack.
Okay, sure, yeah. So let's say that you're throwing down the British flag as the Queen is making her way through. That's what's going on here. That's the image that you're intended to see. Now, the one catch is, why is he on a donkey and not on a war horse? Part of that has to do with the fact that Jesus is not the Messiah that they were expecting. Right? He is a much more humble figure. He will be the Messiah that they're expecting, but he isn't yet. And that's part of what he's been teaching them all along. But there is more to it than that. So let me go forward one slide and go here. Zechariah 9:9, right? Post-exilic prophet, after the Jews returned from exile in Babylon, Zechariah wrote of the coming Messiah. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey. On a colt, the foal of a donkey. I'm going to skip the rest of the time. This is what Jesus is doing. He's deliberately doing exactly what Zechariah 9 said the Messiah would do. And so in Second Temple Judaism, and that means, between the time that the Jews came back from exile in Babylon and the time when Jesus shows up on the scene, that whole period is called the Second Temple period, messianic expectation keeps boiling up. The Maccabean revolt happens, messianic expectation boiling up. People start looking to Zechariah. They look to Daniel. They're looking even to some non-canonical books that are predicting the coming of the Messiah. And Jesus picks one and does exactly that on purpose, because he is telling you, I am this guy. Interestingly, this is just for free, he cuts it right here. And he does everything up to there, and he doesn't do any of this. And that's really interesting. But that's a different conversation. Maybe he will do that in the future. That would be a fine position. So what do we have here as far as this being authentic? This is, again, a multiply attested event. It shows up in the Synoptics. It shows up in John. The criterion of embarrassment is in play here, because if you don't know about Zechariah 9:9, and most Greco-Roman readers would not, you don't know why Jesus is riding on a donkey and looks like a fool compared to Augustus or something like that. He's like a cheap knockoff compared to the real deal. So you think, if you don't know about this. So embarrassment comes into play. Rejection and execution, No doubt about it, absolutely, this would get you killed if the Romans knew about it. And eventually they come to. So again, all three of the criteria are in play here. Let's quickly summarize with Pilate. Sometime later, just a couple of days, I guess 7, because it's a week later, Jesus does end up being arrested and is brought before Pilate. Pilate asks Jesus point blank, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus, in Mark at least, answers, "You have said so." And I think in Matthew it's a little bit more affirmative. "Yes, I am." I can't remember exactly how he phrases it there. But the gist in all of them is that, yes, I am. It's as you say. And if you're not convinced that that's what Jesus meant by it, then ask yourself this: why, a little bit later on, when Jesus is taken to the cross and he is hung on it, why did Pilate nail what's called the titulus, an inscription, to the top of the cross that gives the reason for the criminal's death? He nailed one that was written in 3 languages that said, "Jesus, King of the Jews." Where did that come from? Jesus didn't say it. Where did it come from? And there's really no explanation. So, rejection and execution, this fits. This helps us understand why Jesus was executed. And again, multiple attestation comes into play here as well. There's also, let me mention this before we move on. There's another interesting thing that goes on here, since we're talking about comparing independent accounts of historicity. Some people would ask, how come when Jesus answered Pilate the first time, Pilate still went out to the Jews and waffled? He said, "I didn't find any fault with him, so I'm going to release him." And they're like, "No, I'll give us Barabbas instead." So I've heard people say that's a challenge to rejection and execution. Clearly, this claim was not as big of a deal as you make it out to be. Okay, that's fair until you read John, because what does Jesus say in John's version of the account? John also includes, Jesus not only said, "You have said so," but then he followed it up with, "But my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is of heaven. If my kingdom was of this world, then my angels would be rushing to my aid." That's a paraphrase. But the hosts of heaven would be coming to support me. And so Pilate is like, I don't know if he thought he was crazy or whatever, but he suddenly is like, okay, maybe he's not a threat after all. So he goes and tries to release him. But the fact that he was talked into it and that the inscription ends up on the cross that says King of the Jews, that shows you that it was something Jesus said. Pilate might have understood it to mean something a little bit differently than what we would have first assumed. He might have heard what Jesus said in John's account, thought, okay, maybe he's not really a threat after all. But the fact that it exists and that we all agree that Jesus was executed on the Roman cross for sedition is pretty good evidence that Jesus did in fact claim to be the King of the Jews. And remember, the King of the Jews is the Christ, the Messiah. So, sorry guys, I'm moving a little bit quicker than I normally like to through this, but let's go to our second one here. Son of God. Son of God is an interesting title because it doesn't mean what most people think it means. Most of the time, the assumption for a modern listener or modern reader of the scripture is that when we say Son of God, we're thinking of the post-Council of Nicaea Trinitarian confession, Son of the living God. The third or the second person of the Trinity in relation to the Father and the Holy Spirit. But when Son of God is used in the Gospels, that's not really how it's being used. Because the development of the Trinity was still coming. Not that the Trinity was not latent in the New Testament, but that's not something explicitly taught. And I probably should have phrased that differently, because that might have sounded like I'm not affirming the Trinity, which is not true. But there's a little bit more nuance here. Solomon is referred to as a son of God in 2 Samuel 7, when God gives David the so-called Davidic covenant, said, someone will sit on your throne forever. Your son he'll be to me like a son, I'll be to him like a father. And when he sins, I will rebuke him. So clearly that can't just be talking about a God figure, right? There's an application to the kings of Israel who are in the Davidic line. So when we say that Jesus is the Son of God, it's possible that all that was meant is that he was the Christ. And we, in that case, would have the same category that we already talked about. But what I want to try to establish with you all is that he meant something a little bit different than that. He did mean that, but he took it further. He expanded the title because he claimed this kind of filial relationship with God that nobody else could claim. Let me give you just a couple of examples of this. something that he was known for was speaking in parables, right? One of my favorites that what I'm talking about here is the parable of the wicked tenants. Alluding to Isaiah 5, Jesus tells this parable that, again, I think I'm not going to read it for the sake of time, but he tells a parable where there's a vineyard that is planted by a landowner, and the landowner leases it to tenants, and it's said that he goes into another country. And while he is away, he sends various servants back to that vineyard to collect some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants, as you can infer from the title, if you don't recall the details, do not treat those messengers very well. Some of them they beat, some of them they kill, they send them all away. But at the end, the master still has one person left that he hasn't sent, his beloved son. And so last of all, the landowner sends his son to the tenants in a final appeal, to produce some of the fruit of the vineyard that they owed him, and they killed him instead, because they assumed that by killing the heir, they get the whole inheritance. Now, I said this was an allusion to Isaiah 5. In Isaiah 5, there's a vineyard. The vineyard is Israel. And the vineyard is planted by God. So who is God's son? It's not a king of Israel, right? Because who are the kings of Israel? The kings of Israel are in the same camp as the tenants, right? The people who God leased the vineyard to. Also, it's very heavily implied are the Pharisees and the religious leaders, because Mark even tells us they were acutely aware that Jesus was telling the parable against them, right? So it was about them. They were the bad guys. But who is the son? What does that even mean? Jesus doesn't really say at this point in time quite what that means. But it's clear something is going on here that is a little bit different than just the king of Israel. He has some kind of relationship with God the Father that the rest of them do not have. Now, quickly, through the criteria, you guys are probably sick of me talking about the criteria by now, but I just want to hammer it home so that you know all of these have been very carefully selected to build a case that is, insofar as we can get, relatively ironclad. It's mostly tested, it's in the Synoptics, and it's even in a document called the Gospel of Thomas, which is a non-canonical gospel. We would consider it a forgery for the most part, but it includes this pericope, and so that is treated as another independent source. So we have it in multiple sources, and rejection and execution, absolutely, but on the other side of the equation. This deals with why did the Pharisees want Jesus dead? Why did the Sadducees want Jesus dead? Because he called them out in a very real way. He put them on the spot as the murderers of God's prophets, and ultimately predicted that they would be his murderers as well. So then, I said that kind of alludes that there's some kind of growing relationship here that Jesus doesn't really explain, but that we're detecting where he and the Father have this close relationship. That comes out more in how Jesus talks about the Father. Now, it's not totally dissimilar to Judaism to think of God as a Father. It's not super common. It becomes more common after Jeremiah writes, because around the time that he is prophesying about the new covenant, God says, Israel will be my children. So after that, they start. That's in Jeremiah 31:4, I think. The Israelites do start to kind of think about God as our Father in a general sense. He's the protector, the guardian. But Jesus always talks about my Father. I am the one who reveals the Father. No one knows the Father except through me. That's a little bit interesting. That's not even what the kings of Israel would say, right? Who is this person that says, all things have been handed over to me by my Father? No one knows the Father no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and whom the Son chooses to reveal him. To whom the Son chooses to reveal him. We were talking about John 14 before class. That kind of falls in here too, right? And that's good actually, because that's a multiple attestation of this saying here. Even though they're a little bit different, the saying, they take place in different settings, but the saying is the same, right? No one gets to God but through me. I know the Father. He is my Father. That's not what the Jews would say. That's not what the kings of Israel would say. That is unique. We have to explain that. And we still don't, at this point in our presentation tonight, we can't yet say exactly what that means. All we can say is that this is going another rung up the ladder. Jesus is something special. He's maybe not quite divine yet, but he might be. He's pushing in that direction. He is pushing the ceiling from the ground up. So I'm going to skip this example because I'm going to reuse it in just a second for the last title. So let me order through that. And let's talk about the last title, Son of Man, our final rung on the ladder. Like Son of God, this is a very misunderstood title. And actually, funny story, when I was a kid, maybe like 8, and I was reading the Gospels, one night I was praying, and I remember praying the way that they taught me in church, and I said something about Son of Man, and I thought to myself, like, no, wait a minute, he's not the Son of Man, he's the Son of God. Son of Man, that sounds like blasphemy, doesn't it? He's not the son of, Joseph wasn't his father. You know, Mary was his mother, but God was his father. He's the Son of God. And I don't know, but I kind of suspect a lot of people get confused by that and think, what, Son of Man, that's not who he is. Actually, Son of Man is Jesus' favorite title for himself. It is used over 80 times in the gospel, and all of them by Jesus, with I think one exception. It's dissimilar. This is the only example tonight where the criteria of dissimilarity comes into play, because nobody in Judaism called themselves the Son of Man. There are some examples in the Psalms where Son of Man refers to just a human being. It's kind of a roundabout way or an idiom of saying, like, hey, I'm a human. But they don't use it in the way that Jesus uses it. In the early church, as far as I know, only one person uses the title Son of Man as applied to Jesus, and that is Stephen, as recorded in Acts, right before he's martyred. So it's pretty unique to Jesus, and it's multiply attested all over the place. I'm only going to show you like 2 examples that are really powerful, but just read the Gospels. It's everywhere. It's in all of these different stories, in John, in Mark, in Matthew and Luke. It's all over the place. So what does Jesus mean by it? I am going to suggest, and then attempt to show, that based on contextual clues, when Jesus speaks of the Son of Man, he is referring to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel, written during the exile, very apocalyptic work, as you may have noticed if you've ever gone through it. Lots of visions and strange things that are a little bit difficult to understand. One of the visions comes in chapter 7, and it's so important that we cannot skip this one. We have to read it. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. There's a couple things that you have to be aware of here. Riding the clouds is something that only God does in the Old Testament. No one else does that. That is strictly a God thing. Secondly, in Ancient of Days, by the way, it's a circumlocution of referring to God, God the Father. Of course, when they use the language Father, we already talked about that, but you get the idea. This is who we would say is God the Father. Nobody sits at God's right hand, right? No one can really be in God's presence. If you recall, Moses asked to see his glory, and God, someone in an anthropomorphism, said, I can't show you my glory because you'll die, but you can see my back. And that's it. And then Moses glowed for the rest of his life and had to wear a veil so the Israelites didn't freak out. Adam walked with God before the fall, but then after that, he couldn't be in God's presence anymore. They had to kick him out of the garden, right? Very few people can be in the presence of God. Nobody can be in the presence of God as a sinner and live. So, no one sits at his right hand. And there's more to it even than that. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Nobody can be in his presence even, right? There's another Old Testament passage that I don't have on the screen. It's going to come into play in a second. Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And that is David, presumably talking about his son, the Davidic Messiah. There's a problem with that, and Jesus calls this out as a riddle in Mark 13. He says to those who listen to him, how is it that David says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? If he's David's son, how can David call him Lord? Because this is a highly patriarchal society, right? So the elders are always superior. Jesus never answers it, but he's dropping a hint. Something's going on here. He's not just David's son. He's not just human. And there's more to it, because no one sits at God's right hand. The right hand of the throne is a place of delegated authority, right? Almost, if not, equal authority. So if you are sitting at God's right hand, you are, for all intents and purposes, exercising the exact same authority as God does. That's why when James and John, through their mother, asked Jesus, hey, when you ascend into your kingdom, we want to sit at your right hand and your left. And he says, you don't know what you're asking, because he's God. You can't sit at his right hand. I haven't proven that yet, but I'm going to try to in just a second. So Psalm 110:1, Daniel 7, riding the cloud, sitting at the right hand. Where does all of that come into the fore? When Jesus is being examined by the high priest Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. They convene before they take him to Pilate, and this is the account. But he, that is Jesus, remained silent as the Pharisees and Caiaphas made accusations against him and made no answer. And again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. Why? Why was this blasphemy? Because he said he was going to ride the clouds and he was going to sit at God's right hand. You don't get to do that if you're a human. You just don't. You have to be God. This is a claim to be God. This is probably the most important mic drop in all of the Gospels. I don't know if you've ever realized that before, but this is so huge. And there's even more going on here. Do y'all know, and I'm sure you do, what is the Jewish name for God? Right? I'm going to write it out of respect for if anybody's a Messianic Jew in here, I'm not going to say it. But, right? And you know what the vowels are that go in there? Why am I not saying it? Partly out of respect for if anybody's a Messianic Jew in here and you don't like to pronounce it. Part of it is to illustrate a point. They didn't say it either. So what do we see? Son of the Blessed, right hand of power. They are masking the divine name. Caiaphas said it with a typical euphemism to try to get around it. What Jesus said was probably this. And they changed it in the account that Mark eventually wrote down. I'm going to sit at the right hand of him. That's why Caiaphas flips out and absolutely loses his mind. You know, tearing of the robes is a sign that this is the worst form of blasphemy. There's a great monograph, actually. It's a little bit deep, but by Darrell Bock, specifically on this passage. And it's amazing, all the things, the backgrounds that are going on here. But this is just like, if there was a glass ceiling, Jesus just busted straight through it. And everybody around him knew it, and the next thing you know, he's being taken to Pilate to be executed. So, the last thing that I want to say, just to show you some multiple attestation of that event, that's in the Synoptics. John has something a little bit differently. But what I want you to see with this example, and we could produce many others like it, is that that's not the only place where Jesus uses this language. Okay, Mark 13, I have on the screen, Luke 12, several times in the last week of his life, as Jesus is teaching on future events, he refers to himself being acknowledged as the Son of Man, riding on the cloud. Well, here he claims, actually in this one, it's authority, right? Remember in Daniel 7, that was a big deal too. He was given dominion and authority over all peoples, nations, and languages. What does he have here? You know, the one that denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. Who is Jesus to say that if you don't accept him, that you're being condemned before God because you didn't accept Jesus? How can he say that? Because he thinks he's the Son of Man. How can he say that he's going to come on the clouds with great power and glory? Because he thinks he's the Son of Man from Daniel 7. Right? This is I get excited about this one because it's just so incredibly powerful if you know what he's doing there. And unlike, the things that Paul says, where he says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead and be saved, that's great. Problem is that, some of our friends who are not Christians, they don't care what Paul says. You have to deal with this. You can't avoid this. It's multiply tested. It deals with dissimilarity with the Son of Man saying. It deals with rejection and execution. There is almost, people will try, Herman tries. He deals with it in a very strange way that I unfortunately don't have time to get into. But it's not convincing. This is a very, very difficult problem to deal with if you want to argue that Jesus did not claim to be God. So let me land the plan, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. To recap, and we're going to come in at faster than we're supposed to. As I started to give a number, but I'm not a pilot, so I have no idea what velocity you're actually coming to when you land a plane. But we're going to come in a little bit faster than I normally prefer. Tonight we looked at 3 titles, right? We looked at first Messiah, and we saw that Jesus identifies himself with, at minimum, the human messianic king that the Jews were expecting. That's a big deal in and of itself. But we saw on top of that, we moved up one rung in the ladder, Jesus also believed that he was the Son of God. And when he said that, when others said that about him, it was clear he didn't just mean Messiah. He's starting to claim some kind of relationship with God the Father that is very unique and very different than what anybody else could say. And then we just busted through the ceiling with Son of Man. He believed that he was this divine eschatological figure that can be no one else but God himself, when you understand what's going on with the Jewish literature and the characteristics that all belong to God. And by the way, there are other things that we can produce. You know, the fact that Jesus says that he forgives sins, the Pharisees got it right in Mark 2 when they say, you know, what is he talking about when he says that the paralytic sins are forgiven? Nobody can forgive sins but God alone. This is blasphemy. Yes, they got it. They were right. That was the point. Jesus could forgive sins because he was God. And that's multiply tested all over the place. So there's all kinds of things that we can go into. And where does that leave us? It brings us back to Lewis. Because now the trilemma is valid. Jesus did claim to be God. And as such, he is either a liar, or he is a lunatic, or he is Lord. You have to deal with Jesus. You can't just walk away from him. You may not believe him, but that's fine. You need to make that choice based on the evidence related to his resurrection. I don't know if anybody's going to talk about that this semester, Alan, but you know that's another issue. But you can't just ignore him. You have to come to a conclusion about what you're going to do with Jesus, because he made claims that nobody else made. And if they're true, he's the one who said, you know, the one who denies me before men, I will deny before the angels of God. So he deserves to be taken seriously. And to close, I really like, I'm not one to pepper my presentation with a whole bunch of quotes from other people, but I really like the way that a German theologian, Horst Georg Pullman, referred to this issue. He said, with regard to Jesus, there are only two possible modes of behavior. Either to believe that in him God encounters us, or to nail him to the cross as a blasphemer. Tertium non liter. There is no third way. So I don't know what all of y'all's backgrounds is. I don't know if there's any non-Christians in here. If there are, you know, I invite you to take this seriously and to really consider what you do with Jesus of Nazareth. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Alan would be happy to talk to you about that. And again, I don't know if any of you are in here, but if you are, or if you know somebody who is, and tell them about this stuff, they have to take him seriously. You have to take him seriously. If you are believers in here, as I know many of you are, I hope this gives you confidence that what you believe is really rooted in history. It's not just a fairy tale. And I hope this gives you some tools and some categories that you can use to talk to other people and to engage in meaningful conversations that don't just assume inerrancy. Even though we do believe that. I believe that because of this. This is the first step. Then we get to the resurrection, and then I see, what did Jesus say about the rest of the Bible? What did Jesus say about Paul? What did Paul say about the rest of the Bible? That's how you get there. You start from the ground up, and you work your way out. So thank you for having me in this evening. I know we don't have a ton of time left, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions you'll have before we close. So that's it. Great job. Anything on your minds? Does this make sense for starters? Okay.
So modern skeptics sometimes say, wait a minute, Lewis forgot legend as a fourth option. What do you say about that?
That's a fair, okay. Yeah, and that goes back to the Apollonius Diana thing, because Apollonius could be considered legendary. The key thing there is, well, there's a couple key things. One, the criterion of authenticity work against the legend thing as well.
Exactly.
Because if the tradition is reliable because of those criteria, and again, remember, if it doesn't meet the criteria, it doesn't mean it's not reliable, but if it does meet the criteria, it's probably reliable. That works regardless of when the tradition originated. So what I mean by that is if the Gospels were written even as late as like 100 AD, which is what some people want to say for John, they were written almost in the 2nd century, or then the other Gospels were written in the 80s, 50, 60 years after Christ. Even if they're that late, if it meets the criteria, there's a good chance that that's reliable, because what are you dealing with? You're dealing with oral tradition that has been passed down in a far more reliable fashion than we are capable of today. Again, that's another lecture. But, that dispels the legend bit. As it doesn't really matter when the Gospels were written, as long as we can establish beyond reasonable doubt, or at least beyond the corners of the evidence, that these things were historical. We have a good reason for believing that. Now, the nice thing is we don't even have to do that, because the Gospels were written relatively close to the life of Jesus. Some people want to take issue with that, because they say, why did it take 30 years, or 40 years, as it may be, depending on what you think. But the thing that they fail to think about one, you're dealing with an oral culture that is substantially more reliable in transmitting the gist of narratives and much better than we are today, because that's what they do. They didn't have books like we did. But secondly, now what did I want to say for a second? Oh, yeah, what did I want to say? I don't remember what point 2 was there.
Point one's so strong. That's
Yeah, I don't
all
know.
you
Maybe
need,
I'm trying to think. Was there even a point 2, or did I just make that up? But the point is that you can get from Jesus through then Paul and Peter, because like Mark is reflecting Peter's testimony if you take some of the church fathers of the Lord. Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, almost certainly. I know that gets disputed, but if you really deal with the evidence, it's hard to deny that the person who wrote the Gospel of Luke very apparently is a companion of Paul. Paul met with the other disciples, so he's talked to the eyewitnesses. Oh, I remember what point 2 was. I'll bring it up in a second. So you have Peter's testimony, you have Paul's testimony, which he's gotten compared notes with the other disciples. You have Matthew, who allegedly was a disciple, and you have John. So you have 4 eyewitnesses. And why do you start to get them written a little bit later? Because they were alive before then. And you don't need a biography until somebody's near death, right? Until they've gotten towards the end of their life. And it is a little bit different because it's not a biography about them, but it's a similar idea. Why do you need to write down Peter's account when you have Peter? You can just go talk to him. Go talk to Paul. Go talk to Matthew or to Luke. You know, Luke said that he compiled his count by talking to all these other eyewitnesses, and Paul makes reference to 500 people that apparently saw Jesus after the resurrection. So there were people living all around the area that you could just go talk to who had seen and walked and lived with Jesus. But then they start dying because of persecutions, because they're getting older. Peter is martyred in Rome sometime in the mid-60s. Paul is probably just before Peter. James is martyred. He didn't write a gospel, but I'm sure his testimony is in there in some form or fashion. Again, another talk. But he dies in 62. We have that from Josephus. So they start to die off, and then all of a sudden you start getting written down. They're losing the eyewitnesses, and they want to capture the testimony before it's gone. So right in the fullness of time, so to speak, you do get the testimony. Apollonius and everybody else, it comes hundreds of years later, most of the time.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure we said a little bit of something about Apollonius, because it's really crazy. Like, I went and read, you can get it for free, right? Since it's so old, you can go read that yourself and see what you think. But especially if you get the background of it, it's nothing at all comparable to the Gospels.
No, I think
somebody was paid money, right, by some empress,
That's what I
and
was
it's
gonna
like
say.
there's a financial motive. It's way later. You don't have the multiple attestation, and there's a ton of like anachronisms and historical blunders.
what it seems to be is that there was an empress who was staunchly anti-Christian, and so she paid somebody to write a life of Apollonius. There was a polemic against Jesus.
Yeah.
That's what it seems like it happened. Erman is not willing to accept that. Many other people, even non-Christians, think
They have him like going to Babylon way after it's destroyed.
Yeah,
Just some
right.
really
It
dumb
doesn't-
things.
things that don't satisfy the criteria. Whereas
Yeah.
with Jesus, you do. Yeah, it's night and day. It's a very and that's
For him
why-
to use that, if that's the best he can do, and he would know the best, right? So it's like, that's really weak.
Yeah, it's not a great argument, but Erman, at core, Erman is a very good scholar, but he likes to be provocative, and this is provocative from
He's smart, but he's so smart, he's clever in rhetorical ways that are
and
misleading, I
He
think.
used to write really good, I don't want to get on a tangent, just attacking him, but he used to write some really good pieces in like textual criticism and such. But then he kind of got a chip on his shoulder, and I don't know if you know Erman's story, but he was an evangelical, and he walked away actually during his doctorate, I believe, under Bruce Metzger at Princeton Seminary. And the problem of evil was the big thing for him. So I don't know if any of you struggle with the problem of evil, but that's his big thing. So he walked away from faith, and since then he's become very provocative, and this is a textbook, no pun intended, example of that provocation. Yes?
So with regards to like, the comparisons that are made between Christianity and the mystery religions, like I don't really know much about the mystery religions. Well, they're all kind of still mysteries.
They're hard, yeah. That's part of the problem, yeah.
Mystery religions.
But from what I've gathered, a lot of them, I guess, both Christianity, I think it seems that these similarities that the mystery religions have with Christianity are similarities that they both kind of have with Platonism.
Maybe.
I
I don't think Jesus really does. I think, so Augustine starts to introduce more Platonistic ideas, and then Thomas Aquinas really nails it home in the Middle Ages, when they start kind of rehabilitating the pagan philosophers under a Christian worldview. That's where you get like Thomism and different traditions like that. I don't think a lot of things, even if they look slightly Platonistic, if you dive under what's going on in the Jewish background, it's pretty Jewish, and that's why dissimilarity is really hard to prove, because Jesus was through and through a Jew, and Christianity really is the continuation of Judaism. Judaism split when Christ, came on the earth, and so in a sense, all of us that are Christians are, what's the word I'm looking for? We are converts to a sect of Judaism, whether you realize that or not, because he very much is the Jewish Messiah. Now, he is also the Gentile Messiah, and that's part of the problem, is that they don't recognize that. They misunderstood his mission. But I think there is
The Jews that wrote the New Testament, they're very unlikely to want to adopt these foreign religious ideas and so forth.
And the very quick anecdote. So in the mid-19th century, 20th century, 1950s, 60s, 70s, there was a big tradition to try to look into the Gospels and find, elements of Hellenism, right? Which would be Greco-Roman philosophy and thinking. They'd even find things like light and darkness, and they're like, hey, look, this is Hellenism, this is Greco-Roman stuff. But the problem is if you really know the Old Testament, no, it's not. There's light and darkness in Genesis. There's light and darkness in the literature of Qumran, which was a separatist, Jewish community living on the Dead Sea that hated Hellenism, and they have stuff in light and darkness. So it gets confused a lot. Sometimes people will talk about these Greco-Roman categories, but they're not really Greco-Roman categories. They're actually also Jewish, and they just don't realize that because they haven't done their homework.
There was a part of the Gospels where Jesus was talking to a bunch of Greeks.
Mm-hmm. I think you're thinking John.
The mustard seed one.
Okay.
The part of the one where he says, where he compares himself to a mustard seed. Yeah, that's in John.
Mm-hmm.
And also it is thought that Plato himself may have indirectly through Pythagoras been influenced by Judaic ideas.
That's interesting. I've never heard that before. I don't know. That would be interesting to look into.
Because there was, I don't know, I
Possible
got this from some YouTube videos, so take it with a grain of salt.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
I'd be interested in that if that's true.
There's some attestation of Plato studying under Pythagoras, and Pythagoras, who himself apparently spent some of his younger years studying under Jewish scholars.
Is that right? That's very interesting. I didn't know that. I'll have to look that up later.
Who may have been, but I don't know.
I don't know. That's
Interesting.
Food for thought.
Well, we probably are out of time at this point, I think.
Are we?
What are
Okay.
where are we going out to eat tonight, Seth?
Sounds like it's Sonic.
Well, it's still-
Have some
Awesome.
nice weather out, so. Yeah, exactly.
You don't like Sonic?
Not particularly.
Everyone has an opinion.
Anyway, yeah,
Wait for the
thanks.
show.
That was a great job. Good discussion.
Thank you for entertaining me this whole time. I appreciate it, guys.
There's a list of restaurants that